Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Brian. We're going to do a special selection today, which is where one of you tell me exactly what it is I need to check out. Today's special selection comes at us from Joe. We are continuing on with our Frost journey. It says this is Frost's only fully instrumental track in their entire catalog, and it was the opening track on their debut album, Million Town. It's a popular one, so I hope you enjoy it. So let's dive into this. We've listened to some instrumental sections within Frost's work, and I'm kind of assuming that this is going to be similar to that, especially since it comes off of the same album as Million Town, the 26-minute epic that we've listened to from them, and Blacklight Machine, which is a 10-minute song that we've listened to from them, both which featured some instrumental segments. So let's dive into the opening of this album called Hyperventilate. See what they're bringing to the table today. Beautiful ideas with this piano runs, but I think what really sells it is the organic atmosphere around it. I think it's still just instruments, but it paints a picture of being in the wilderness. That's a fun little line. Yeah, as we begin to dance around it, yeah, I can get into this. Shifting between downbeats and offbeats on the hi-hat accents gives the song a nice push and pull rhythmically, which is only embellished by the syncopation of that core line. So I thought it was in 4/4, but I think it's actually 7/8. Okay. It's interesting listening to this, having just checked out Dream Theater and hearing some similarities between how they compose odd time signature riffs. Frost just always finds a way to utilize note intervals and chord progressions that feel so. It's not just beauty; it's joy. They find happiness in music. I think that's awesome. Ooh, spicy little angle there to pull into this, which is a fair bit darker. I find this really interesting that this is their debut album and the first sound that people heard from this band putting in this CD. To me, at least, it's very clear they wear their inspirations on their sleeve. What is it with Frost? Every song has a section I could really see in a Sonic the Hedgehog soundtrack. I love that. Tons of levity, just a very light and bright feeling. Like walking on air, not soaring, just walking. And here's the twist into the resolution. And using the resolution to introduce the first note of the next section. Very cool. So we have shifting accent patterns on that snare hit, but I think we are in 5/4. But it feels like we're tripping all throughout it. Very interesting. Love that bass line. Bringing back the main motif to wrap this up. Very nice choice. What was that there at the end? Did they go whole tone for a moment? That was a wild run up. Yeah, so this is pretty much what I expected for them, having heard some of their instrumental sections on songs that are also on this album. I don't think there's anything in here that surprised me as far as my expectations to what they were going to be doing. But there are some very cool moments in here. Aside from those moments, though, I think most of my analysis, my comments here is just going to be exactly what I've said about Frost in the past. So I'll do a little bit of a greatest hits roundup and try to keep that short and sweet. But yeah, so like one thing that I've noticed here, though, that I don't think I really heard. I mean, it's been a year, I think, when we checked out Blacklight Machine, and it was probably half a year later when we checked out Million Town, and that was some time ago, so I could be misremembering things. But the idea of callbacks in here, I mentioned there at the end, at the 7-minute mark, we had the core motif from the beginning of the track jump in, and it wasn't just that line itself, it was the whole section, I believe. Then after that, we hit the heavy section, which we had heard twice before, but we had a brand new part on top of that. And it's this recurring concept that we hear in here that I think works rather well primarily because they keep it short and that the recurrences, they have distance between them. And this is actually, again, like I mentioned earlier, it's very interesting listening to this, having just listened to Dream Theater 2 days ago, I think, yesterday. I don't remember when we checked out Dream Theater. It was relatively recently this week. Um, and I had mentioned that in part two, that movement four was just really lengthy, and we continued to return back to this core motif element and then explore away from it, return back to the motif and explore in a different direction. And it was actually the repetition that I was finding to make it a bit too long in the tooth, and I wish they would just have done one idea or maybe two and then moved on, rather than have explored that section for as long as they did. And there's probably some people who are ready to jump on. Bryan, just the other day on Dream Theater, you were talking about recurring ideas, but I really think what stands out to me here is the distance between them. What felt like an isolated section at the beginning of the song ends up being a recurring idea in the vastness of the track. When you get 4 minutes into a song and you haven't, well, 4 minutes into a 7 minute song, halfway through, give or take, and you haven't heard a section we heard at the beginning a second time yet, especially with a band like this that is constantly moving to new ideas, there really isn't any cyclical concept to the structure here. It feels like, for a vast amount of time, a series of linear ideas, always moving to something new. And so that kind of becomes the framework. Where do we go next? What's the next idea they're going to present to us? And so I find it really refreshing when we do bring back a recurring concept, when we do return to something we had already heard. And it allows the song to feel less like a linear journey and more of a cyclical one. Maybe not necessarily in how the events transpire, but maybe a thematic cyclicality to it, where we are constantly moving forward. I don't think this is a song that is built on cycles in any way, but being able to get to the end of this and say, oh, yeah, these ideas we checked out at the beginning of the track, they're present here as well. And what do they mean now that we've been on this journey? And it brings all these concepts of thematic resonance into the song. And I like how they did that. I thought it was really refreshing when we got to the end of the song. I was like, hey, wait, I know this part. And we sort of end where we began, but we went on a really long journey. What does all that mean in the context of hyperventilation, or to hyperventilate? I'm not really sure yet. My brain hasn't really reached that point, but maybe in the next 15, 20 minutes, I might come to some sort of conclusion on it. But I do like that idea of linear cyclicality of bringing ideas back. And I think they do it in a rather effective way, never overutilizing them. In fact, I might say that some of the motifs are underutilized, but the idea left is that I'm wanting more. I'm left wanting more rather than ready to move on to the next idea. And I've always said that boredom is the worst thing that art can do. And so I would much, much rather be left saying, oh, I would love to have heard more of that, which I can. I can just play the song again and hear it again on my own time, rather than, geez, can we get to the next idea? This is definitely drawn out. One, to me at least, is definitely a better reaction than the other. Now, something that Frost does really well is the balance of light and dark. A lot of this song still has that progressive contemporary rock vibe. It captures the joy and levity and brightness in their music that I tend to also relate to Big Big Train, despite making a very different kind of rock. But there's something about both of those bands where I kind of get the idea that if you played these for an older relative, they wouldn't be so turned off to them as they would maybe radio rock or something a bit harder. There is a brightness and a levity and a joy that both bands like to capture. Frost just does it a little heavier than Big Big Train does. And I do like that. Even, again, I did not intend to do so many comparisons this week, but having them so close together, I mean, it's fresh in my mind. Dream Theater also finds balance between two extremes of having heavier and darker and more complex, and then lighter and more accessible. But even they don't go to this extreme. There is something about the way that Frost writes here that's sort of rock for all audiences in a lot of ways. There's some sections that certainly get a bit heavier than I think your average person would listen to, but there's still a good majority of this track that feels like that very acceptable kind of rock. And I love how Frost really leans into that. I don't know if that was something that they intended to do or if it's something they fell into. That is to say, I don't know if they specifically targeted, because the thing is I can't really think of any bands like Frost. If you're going to make that hyper accessible, we could play this in a theme park kind of rock music, you're usually not going for the less palatable progressive side of writing. You want your composition, the accessibility of your composition, to match the accessibility of your sonic palette. And Frost doesn't do that. And I can't think of any other band that sounds like them because of that. And I've always really liked that about them. Now, we do hear some heavier stuff in here, and I find this to be really interesting because I know it was either Blacklight Machine or Million Town. I don't remember. One of them, though, went into some heavier sections, and I think I even called it out for being. You know what? I might be getting this mixed up with Spock's Beard. Is that the band? Spock's Beard is kind of like Frost, isn't it? I think they're very distinct. I wouldn't get them confused, but they're definitely in the same area of prog rock as far as their sound. Anyways, I think in a previous Frost reaction, I had talked about their heavier sections feeling a bit out of place and maybe even a bit cheesy, juxtaposed with their very sincere positivity that they present in their music. And here I didn't really get that. I think they really found the balance here of bringing in the edge and leaning into it a bit more than I think they did last time, and allowing the darkness and the bite and grit of the compression and overdrive to really come through and to find that aggression in a way that, again, doesn't feel cheesy. It doesn't feel reined in. Metal feels like it has fangs. In the past, Froststar feels like they've been wearing prosthetic fangs, where they don't have the animosity, but they have a little bit of the look. And that's sort of how I perceived their heavier sections. But again, here I think it all kind of works out well. The heavier sections fit the flow of the song rather well, and I feel like they fit the sonic palette. I don't understand how this one worked and the other track didn't, so I might be misremembering, or I might be remembering Frost's utilization of this on a different album, or maybe they went for a different production style on the heavier parts. I don't know. What I do know, though, is that this was a bit unexpected for me, and it ended up working really well. Speaking about accessibility, which kind of has been like the whole point of this analysis so far, I think they do a really great job of creating something that is progressive. Much of this song is written in 7 or 5 pulse bars. We don't really have any 4/4 in here, and the odd time signatures we have are in odd times. Not just that they're not 4/4, but that the number of beats per bar is not even. And yet they still find a way to make it all flow. And a lot of this is done through a very tricky but fun shifting cadence within whatever the lead instrument's accent pattern is. The thing with an odd time signature, such as 5, we have 5 beats per bar. So say we're in 5/4. 2 bars of that is 10, which is now even, which is now evenly divisible. And what we can do is actually apply things across the bar. Say that we are going to put an accent on every other beat. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. And now it's lined back up. But what happens is that on the first bar, we're accenting 2 and 4, and on the second bar, we're accenting 1, 3, and 5. It makes the two bars feel very different, and if we have a 1-bar phrase, maybe from the guitar's riff, its accent pattern is going to shift against this every other beat that maybe the snare is doing. And so it's going to create this pulse that if you follow along with it, you can keep a consistent groove in your body, dancing, headbanging, moving your hips, whatever. And you never have to get off of it. You never have to find that weird jostle from 5 to 1. But it's going to feel odd against the core riff because it is going to shift its relationship to these new accent points. And I think that it's really great how they're able to do this in a way that is accessible by giving you this backbeat groove that you can move along to as long as you lock into it, while still allowing the song to feel very complex because every bar feels like it is in a different rhythmic groove than the other. And yet you, a person who has no understanding about rhythms and the math behind time signatures and polyrhythms, you can still groove along with it. How is that possible? It's because they hide this information in there in a way that makes these odd choices and complex rhythmic ideas accessible. And they do such a great job of it. And when you pair that with the bright, cheery, joyful sound of a lot of this, it creates a progressive rock for the masses. From that perspective, I find it really odd that they're not as big as someone like Dream Theater. I wonder how much of that has to do with time of release. Dream Theater came out in the 90s. I don't know when in the 90s, but that seems about right. Having a bit of a gut choice there. I don't have Wikipedia pulled up. But Frost came out in the mid-2000s. Their debut album was 2006. That is a really big difference in time. But I also wonder if maybe Frost just never broke into the realms of modern music listeners. While I was listening to this track, I was thinking about how well it was composed, the fantastic production at play, the accessibility through all of it, and I really started to think, wow, Frost must be a really big band. What are their Spotify plays? They have 11,000 monthly listeners. That is not a lot, and that kind of confounds me. What is it about Frost that just can't break into people's playlists? Is it something in the production? Is it something in their sounds? It kind of airs into the realm of progressive metal at times, but is the lightness of the progressive rock sounds too light for prog metal fans? Are the heavy parts too heavy for prog rock fans? Maybe it just doesn't fit anywhere. I mentioned that they definitely wear their inspirations on their sleeves. I hear Rush in here. I hear a bit of King Crimson. I hear some Dream Theater, but it definitely isn't classic prog rock. But it also isn't the modern prog rock either. This doesn't feel right to put it in the same camp as Porcupine Tree. Or why am I blanking out on modern progressive rock bands? I don't know. Leprous. Yeah, there's another good one. They're still really focused on riffs more so than vibes. So it feels like it's in the middle ground between a lot of realms, and maybe they just don't really have an appeal because of that. Maybe they're super niche because they sit in between a lot of worlds, but I find that to be one of the most fascinating elements of them. They can write things that are so accessible. Like I said, I could hear them in family-friendly outings, theme parks and stuff. Then they have sections that I think could very easily show up on a Dream Theater album. And they have everywhere between these two ends of the spectrum. And maybe that makes them really difficult to market to people. I don't know. I'm curious if it's a case of people just haven't heard of them, or if people have heard of them and they're just like, they're okay. It bounces off of them because they cover such a wide sonic palette. We'll call it that. Um, I will say though, my only criticism is that this is very difficult to follow. I think a lot of that has to do with the speed that we move through so many ideas. The recurring concepts is a nice moment for me to kind of catch my breath and try to put some pieces together. But on the whole, this is a song that requires multiple listens. The odd time signatures, the odd phrasing, the polyrhythmic ideas, the general speed through some of the faster shred moments, both on keyboard and guitar, it allows the song, at least for me, to turn into a massive blur where I kind of get the surface ideas throughout most of it, but I don't really get a strong gist of the ride itself. Much like a roller coaster, it takes a few times to get through it until you can piece out what would you, tricks? What are they called? The loop de loop and the corkscrew and the drop and all these things, right? Before you can start to piece out the order of how all this is put. Your first time through, it's just wind and color and blue and then green and then blue and then green as the sky and the grass shift places below and above you. And at the end of it, you're like, man, that was a blast, but I don't know what happened. And that's what this song feels like for me, at least after this first listen. I enjoyed my time with all of it. It went by very quickly. I'm not really sure what happened specifically in a lot of places, but there's a lot of things in here that I enjoyed. The solos are impressive from a technical standpoint, but I'm sure if I got more time with it, I could hear some of the melodic elements in there that are pretty cool. Regardless, we do have some slower lead melodies in here that I really loved. I've always praised Frost's melody writing, and I think this doesn't disappoint either. The drum work is technical and impressive. The bass work is fantastic. I love how we have a bass with moving parts, sometimes melodic, sometimes counterpoint, sometimes just foundational and walking. And then, the keyboard work is just awesome every time. I do kind of miss miss the vocals. I think it's a nice counter and a nice timbre change. Having the lead melody be presented through another sound, it would have helped with a little bit of contrast and dynamicism, dynamic writing here, just allowing the sonic palette to have a little bit of a wider range. But otherwise, I mean, it's an exceptional song. And like I said, this is what people might have heard first. You pop in the very first Frost album that's ever released, and this is the song you're introduced to, and they knock it right out the gate. And all you can do is say, yes, I want more. Let's continue on with this album. I do find it really interesting, though, that at least as far as this album is concerned with Spotify listeners, they stop here. We have almost 1 million plays on this, and then tracks 2, 3, and 4 are in the 200,000s, losing a fifth of the listeners. Tracks 5 and 6, which is what I was introduced on, are a bit more popular at 400,000 each, but Hyperventilate's the big one. And I'm curious why people stopped here. Especially if you enjoyed it. Presumably you listened to this and you're like, this is awesome. That's all I needed, though? Kind of confuses me. There's no lyrics on this, though, and as I mentioned earlier, it's all sort of a blur. I don't really have a narrative element here. I was kind of hoping to, as I talked, to form some sort of concept about the idea of hyperventilation and how that might refer back to the song, but at this point, I don't have any way to tie those two elements together. So, let's wrap this up then. This is my thoughts on Frost's Hyperventilate. This is like the 6th time we checked him out, and I still want to call him Froststar. Frost's Hyperventilate. Let me know what you thought of this. Put your thoughts, ideas, opinions, perspectives, everything else into the comment section. Above that, in the description box, if you could. No. In the description box is a link for Linktree. If you click on it, it'll take you here, where you can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. That's where that phrase is supposed to fit. I jumped the gun on that a bit. Anyways, I appreciate all 3 of those. They help with the channel growth and stuff like that. Alright, we're done with this one. We do have a reaction to some brand new music coming up next. I don't know what song it is. I haven't picked it out yet. But it's going to be something that's come out in the last week or so. And it's always really cool to check stuff out that's super current. So that's what we're doing next. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC. As usual, we're going to check out an entire album. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.